Hello, I'm Jess.
And I'm also Jess.
And we're here to talk to you about how to support maintainers in open source.
So before we dive in, we wanted to start with a quick question. I guess by show of hands, who here has used a piece of software that depends on open source? Everyone, yeah. But can you keep your hand up if your company has directly paid for every single one of those libraries? Yeah, no. The gap between the value we'll receive and the support we provide is kind of the heart of what we're here to talk about today. Because this system is powering our entire digital civilization. In early 2024, the Harvard Business School tried to put a number on the value of the system. And they estimated that if companies had to build all of the open source software that they use internally, their cost would be over $8.8 trillion, which isn't market cap or revenue, it's replacement cost. So if it's not built by a traditional company, how do open source projects get made? Well, it's built in what Eric S. Raymond famously called the bazaar model. Unlike the cathedral, where software was built by small, isolated teams behind closed doors, the open source bazaar is seemingly chaotic, but a highly effective system of global collaboration. The dance all happens in the open. The source code is open for anyone to inspect. It gives you the freedom to learn from it, to adapt, to fix problems, and most importantly, to share your improvements back with everyone. A developer anywhere in the world can copy the code, make an improvement, and then offer back that change as a pull request. And it's then the maintainer's job to review this contribution and decide if it gets merged into the official project. This model enables rapid innovation, but it also places an immense burden on a very small number of people. At the center of any healthy project are its maintainers. These are the key individuals who guide the project, and they're also the ones that spend countless hours reviewing code from contributors, ensuring quality, and just keeping the project alive. But they're supported by a wider community of contributors. An interesting tidbit that was also in that paper was that 96% of OSS value is created by only 5% of OSS developers, which is around 3,000 people, which means that a huge amount of power and responsibility lies in a very small percentage of the supply chain, which nothing says better than the classic dependency comic from XKCD. And yeah, this model has a hidden fragility. The immense value it created is disconnected from the resources provided to the people maintaining it. We have this massive bazaar of widespread dependencies on infrastructure that's maintained by volunteers in their spare time. So what happens when this foundation cracks?
That's a really good question, Jess. What happens when a security vulnerability is discovered in one of these foundational components? Who is responsible for the fix? What happens when a maintainer burns out from the pressure? Or worse, what happens when someone with malicious intent offers to take their place? This isn't a theoretical risk. This is a software supply chain risk, and it affects every single one of us. To understand it, we need to look at just how deep our dependencies go. So let's do that. Let's look under the hood of the modern application. When you run pip install or npm install or whichever ecosystem you're working in, you don't just get the one package. You'll typically see a list of packages that you'll install as well. These are the dependencies of the package, but they aren't just a flat list. You make a decision to add some handful of direct dependencies. You vet them, you trust them. They do what you need and you know exactly what they're intended to do. And this level seems simple enough. But the problem is that your dependencies, well, they have their own dependencies. And they have dependencies too. And if a vulnerability exists deep down this chain in some tiny package that you've never even heard of, that vulnerability doesn't stay in that package. The vulnerability might get exposed through some other package, which in turn affects your package and creates a critical security hole in your application, all because of a leaf package that you didn't even know you were using. Your attack surface isn't just the code you write or the libraries you choose. It's in every single line of code they depend on, all the way down. And the scale of this hidden complexity is staggering. We track some of this, and the pattern is consistent across every ecosystem. The dependencies you choose are just the tip of the iceberg. So let's take Cargo, the package manager for Rust. For the average package, you add about 6 direct dependencies. but those 6 pull in on average over 60 indirect dependencies. That's a 10-fold explosion. In Java's Maven ecosystem, it's a similar story. An average of 6 direct dependencies and around 33 indirect ones. The vast majority of code in your application is code you didn't write from maintainers that you don't know anything about. And it's not just the breadth, it's the depth. On average, the code you rely on is around 6 steps removed from you, but the maximum depth is a completely different story. We've seen dependency chains over 60 steps long. You cannot possibly know anything meaningful about a package that's 60 degrees of separation away from your code. And no ecosystem demonstrates this explosive complexity quite like JavaScript. This is driven somewhat by the philosophy of micropackaging, where even single-line functions can be published as a library. This culture, combined with the complexity of the web, creates a dependency graphs of unbelievable size. For example, there's the package isEven, which is a fairly small and somewhat simple library in itself. And when you look at its dependence, it depends on the isOdd package. And thousands of packages unknowingly depend on these. Here's the package D3 at a specified version. And this is all of D3's dependencies, direct and transitive. And as far as dependency graphs go, this is a fairly modest one. But there are actually 10 to the power of 81 different valid ways of resolving this dependency graph. That's more variance on the dependency graph than there are atoms in the observable universe. So you're trusting a frankly infinite number of variations. And this isn't just a technical system of code and dependencies. There is a social system on top of this. This is actually a social graph, and often that's where a lot of the problems can lie. The examples we're going over in this talk are problems of exploitations of this social layer that resulted in real security incidents. We've seen that in general, 98% of the time when a package is affected by a security vulnerability, it's actually affected indirectly. And this might sound somewhat theoretically, but let me tell you a story about a package called leftpad. So once you account for whitespace, this is effectively 11 lines of code. It doesn't do anything particularly clever. It's adding padding to the start of a string. But in March 2016, its owner had a naming dispute with NPM and deleted all of their packages, including this tiny package. And that effectively broke the internet. Thousands of projects, including massive ones like React, suddenly failed to build. Global software development ground to a halt, all because of 11 lines of code. Your multi-million-dollar product could have gone down because of a developer you've never heard of who wrote a trivial helper function, just had a bad day. This is the fragility of our supply chain. It's not about vulnerabilities. It's about stability. It's about the human element. And leftpad is really the gift that keeps on giving. NPM's response was to make it impossible for maintainers to unpublish a package if other packages depended on it, which sounds fairly reasonable, but it's effectively inverting the typical cause of effect of packages and dependencies. And so I think last year, a developer created a package called everything. And this depended on, well, everything. It listed every single public package on NPM as a dependency. So for a brief time, it was impossible for any maintainer to unpublish any package on NPM. The entire ecosystem frozen by one person's prank. It's a fairly strange world where someone else depending on your work can take away your control over it. And these stories from leftpad to everything might seem fairly amusing, but they reveal a fundamental truth. Our software supply chain isn't just a chain of code. It's a massive, interconnected, and often fragile web of human relationships and trust. And that brings us to the most important question of all. Who can you trust?
So we're going to start here with a sobering statistic. In 2024, a Synopsys report found that nearly half, or 49%, I think it was, of all code bases they scanned contained open source components with no new development activity in the last 2 years. And these packages aren't necessarily insecure. They're just dormant or abandoned, digital ghost towns, if you will, which created a perfect breeding ground for attack because no one's watching the gates. So this is about one package, which you might have heard of. It's a popular package called EventStream. EventStream had millions of weekly downloads. Its author, like so many open source maintainers, was doing this in his spare time. He was busy with his job, his life, and he'd moved on to other things. But in 2018, a friendly user contacted him offering to take over the project. The author saw it as a relief, a chance to pass the torch and shed some responsibility. He did what many of us would have done. He said yes, and he handed over ownership. Unfortunately, the new maintainer was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Almost immediately, he published a new version of EventStream that added a dependency on another package, which was also controlled by him, called FlatMapStream. This new package contained an encrypted hidden payload just waiting for a trigger. The payload would only decrypt and execute if the host project was a very specific application, which was a Bitcoin wallet. And if it found itself inside that wallet, its mission was simple: steal the Bitcoin, which it did. Classic supply chain attack. The attacker's goal was never EventStream directly, it was the Bitcoin wallet. EventStream was just the Trojan horse as such. But that's not the most interesting part of this attack. After releasing this infected version, a week later he removed the malicious dependency and published a new clean version, which was a major version. And because of how versioning works in NPM, most projects that depend on EventStream would automatically update to the patched version that had been updated, but they wouldn't, which was the infected version, but they wouldn't automatically update to the new major version. So it caused the infected version to keep spreading, but if a security researcher or a diligent developer decided to audit the package, they would look at the latest code on GitHub for version 4.0 and see nothing wrong. So this was like a crime happening in plain sight, and the evidence was hidden from anyone who was looking. And in fact, this attack wasn't discovered for months, and then only by complete accident by a developer examining a build warning. But that's when it's abandoned. What happens when what's causing the burnout is the attack itself?
This isn't a hypothetical question. This is exactly what happened last year in what is now considered one of the most sophisticated and audacious supply chain attacks ever attempted. This is the story of XE. Unlike the EventStream attack, which is opportunistic, this was a long con, a patient, deliberate, multi-year infiltration. It began all the way back in 2021 when a new contributor appeared on the XE project mailing list. XE is a data compression utility, and it's fundamental to almost every Linux distribution on the planet. And so for 2 years, this new maintainer, under the name Geotan, was a model open source citizen. They submitted helpful patches. They gained the trust of the project's longtime overworked maintainer. And over time, they were given more and more responsibility, eventually becoming a co-maintainer with the power to commit code directly and create new releases. This wasn't a hack. This was a relationship, carefully cultivated over years to gain the ultimate prize, trust. And once Geotan was in position, the social engineering campaign began. A handful of new users, sock puppet accounts, appeared on the mailing list, and they started applying pressure on the existing maintainer. They complained about bugs. They said progress is too slow. They wrote things like, "The project seems to be abandoned. Why is it taking so long?" And they suggested that maybe Geotan, the helpful new contributor, should be given more control. And here's the most important, the most chilling part of this story. To anyone who has spent any time in open source, this looked completely normal. The constant low-grade hostility, the sense of entitlement from users, the demands for the free labor of a volunteer's time. This is the background radiation that maintainers endure every single day. A 2021 Tidelift survey found that nearly 60% of maintainers have felt personally attacked for their role in a project. The social engineering worked because it was indistinguishable from the normal toxicity our community has been forced to accept. The pressure campaign wasn't an anomaly. It was a weaponized form of the status quo. They sent these sorts of messages because they knew this was the expectation, the culture of open source development. They did their research. These were advanced attackers. They knew this was the approach to get exactly what they wanted. And how was this attack stopped? Not by an advanced AI scanner, not by multi-million-dollar security products. The internet was saved by one person's curiosity. Andres Freund, a PostgreSQL developer at Microsoft, was troubleshooting a performance issue and noticed that logging into machines with SSH was taking half a second longer than it should. That was it. And he dug into this and he unraveled this entire sophisticated plot just days before the malicious version of Exe was due to be included in the next major release of Debian and Red Hat Linux. We got lucky. We got incredibly lucky. We were saved by one person having the time, skill, and curiosity to pull on a tiny thread. The Exe incident is a wake-up call. It proves that attackers are watching. They've learned that our community's tolerance for harassment is a vulnerability that they can exploit. They're using our worst habits as their best camouflage. This malicious, targeted pressure is an acute threat, but it's layered on top of a chronic, day-to-day burden that is pushing maintainers to the brink. And that's what we need to look at next. So what is the weight of this open source maintenance?
Yeah, so the XZ attack was a single deep wound, but for most maintainers, the threat isn't one big event. It's a daily reality of 1,000 tiny cuts that drain their time, their energy, and their will to continue. Beyond simply reviewing and merging pull requests, handling issues, maintainers are facing more and more responsibilities that wear them down until they burn out. And so we're going to have a look at what the daily grind looks like in 2025. So in the current open source model, the people responsible for security are the maintainers. And while on the surface, tools that scan your dependency and tell you about known vulnerabilities like Dependabot and our own OSV scanner are fantastic, but sometimes this leads to a bombardment of warnings and alert fatigue for the maintainers. A lot of the time, these security warnings are false positives, irrelevant to how their project is used, or are for development dependencies that never touch production. It's like a smoke alarm that goes off every single time you make toast. After the 20th time, you kind of stop paying attention. As developers of OSV Scanner, we've seen the effects of this and are mindful of designing our tools with empathy for the developer. We're trying to incorporate things like reachability and other methods to make sure that we aren't overwhelming maintainers, but still getting a good amount of security out of it. But we recognize that every alert, real or not, costs the maintainer time and burdens them with this extra cognitive load. It's like a constant tax on their attention. And there's also a new burden, which is AI slop. These are often low quality, often completely wrong bug reports and pull requests generated by LLMs, along with all of the AI generated pull requests that get in there as well. For the AI slop bug reports, these aren't usually just harmless spam. They're actually insidiously time consuming because an AI generated report will often look plausible. It sometimes will hallucinate a function that doesn't exist in the code base and then file a critical security report about a vulnerability in that non-existent function. The maintainer is then obligated to spend their precious time investigating the phantom bug, only to realize it was complete nonsense generated by a machine. And then lately, maintainers are also facing the effects of pending legislation like the CRA, or Cyber Resilience Act over in the EU. Based on advice compiled by the OpenSSF, open source projects and maintainers, as long as they aren't making a profit, generally aren't beholden to this piece of legislation. But as Daniel Stenberg, or Badger I should say, this is a security conference, blogged about a few weeks ago, open source projects are beginning to feel the effects. In this blog post, he received this cybersecurity risk assessment request from a company who wanted him to basically answer a bunch of questions that were mostly publicly available. The problem here is that if every company who uses curl decided to send one of these requests, I think they would spend more time filling those out than actually doing development. So looking at the whole picture of a Monday maintainer, they're facing hostility from users, as we saw with Exit. They're drowning in a sea of automated alerts, and they're wasting time debunking AI-generated nonsense, as well as all of the legal liability they're dealing with for volunteer work. which isn't just a recipe for burnout, it's a recipe for insecure software. An exhausted, overwhelmed, and fearful maintainer is one who's more likely to make a mistake, more likely to miss a sophisticated contribution like Jiatan's, or more likely to just give up and hand the keys to the next person who asks nicely, like Event Stream. So with our current maintainers burning out, retiring, or quitting under all this pressure, it begs the question, where does the next generation come from?
And that's an important question. In theory, the answer is fairly simple. Someone who uses a project, who cares about it deeply, becomes a newcomer, makes a contribution, and over time, through good work and mentorship, they build up trust and become a core contributor, and maybe one day even eventually a maintainer. That's the open source circle of life. But the reality is that this pipeline is incredibly leaky, and the leaks start right at the very first interaction. For decades, many corners of our community have had an unspoken hazing ritual for newcomers. Read the friendly manual culture that's often anything but friendly. A culture of gatekeeping that scrutinizes and often dismisses first-time contributions. One of the foundational philosophies you'll often hear about is this idea of meritocracy. The idea is really powerful and democratic in theory. It's built on the principle of show me your code. It doesn't matter if you're a student or a senior engineer. In theory, your ability to contribute is what grants you influence and voice in a project. Your status is tied to merit, the quality and value of what you give back to the project. And this typically happens in tangible ways. You can submit high-quality pull requests that get merged, or write fantastic pieces of documentation that help hundreds of users. Over time, these consistent, valuable actions can build you a reputation. Your opinion starts to carry more weight, and you might be asked to take on more responsibility, like becoming a maintainer. But in recent years, the open source community has had serious conversations about this myth of meritocracy. The ideal might sound pretty noble, but the reality is much more complex. First, there's the privilege of time. Contributing to open source often happens outside work hours. Who has that luxury? This can filter out people with demanding jobs, caregiving responsibilities, or just less financial stability. Second, what we define as merit is subjective. A brilliant but abrasive programmer might seem as high merit, but they might also drive away 5 other potential contributors. We're realizing that skills like communication, empathy, and mentorship are just as vital to a project's health as raw coding ability. And third, unconscious bias is real. Studies and anecdotes have shown that contributions can be judged differently based on the perceived gender, name, or nationality of the contributor. This is where a lack of diversity and inclusion becomes a direct threat to security. A landmark 2017 study found that pull requests on GitHub submitted by women were actually accepted at a higher rate than those by men, but only when their gender was not identifiable. In practice, merit often becomes a synonym for assimilating to a project's dominant communication style, navigating these unwritten social rules, and frankly, having the free time and energy to push through that initial resistance. When that happens, meritocracy stops being a filter for quality and becomes a filter for conformity. A strict adherence to merit can become an excuse for gatekeeping, for shutting down newcomers with harsh, technically correct criticism, and creating a toxic environment. Research shows that diversity has a positive effect on a project outcomes generally, and for open source projects in particular. The informal space of open source compounds this. And due to the absence of workplace protections, there's less support and ability for open source. There's less protections. And this allows open source spaces to become entrenched, and underrepresented identities can face an uphill battle to break through. So we can look at the impact this has on security by digging into the Swiss cheese model. This is a defense in-depth strategy. We have multiple layers of security to prevent incidents. There'll always be some gaps in each layer, but it's only when those gaps line up that we get an incident. Issues happen when the holes align. A threat slips through the first layer, then the second, and so on until it breaches your system. So how do we prevent the holes from aligning? We add diversity. If we have a monoculture, there's less diversity in these gaps. More diverse layers is fundamentally more secure. This is why a diverse community is a core part of the security model for open source software, and it's also a powerful lesson for your own organization. Open source security is built on the idea of transparency. Unlike proprietary software, where the code is hidden behind a wall, open source code is out in the open. It's available for anyone to read, to inspect and analyze. And the real magic happens when we consider who is looking at the code. It's not just a small internal team. It's a global community of thousands of developers, security researchers, and enthusiasts. The collective scrutiny, the many eyes principle, means that many people are looking for vulnerabilities. And with more eyes comes a higher likelihood of finding things and fixing them quickly. And this is where a diverse set of perspectives becomes a huge asset. A developer in one country might spot a logical flaw that another researcher in another country might have a unique background to understand. These diverse viewpoints provide and combine to create a much more comprehensive security review than any single company could achieve on its own. The XE payload wasn't identified by code review. It wasn't identified when the change was getting added to Debian. It was identified by someone investigating a 500 millisecond delay in SSH. And the event stream payload was found by someone looking into a build error. Perspective matters. When we rely on review and human perception to identify security issues or bugs, we need different perspectives. We can look into this as well in terms of the ecosystems we create in the code. So overall, we want to have sparser dependency graphs, fewer dependencies, creating less exposure to for users. But more ecosystem diversity provides users with more options and means there's fewer single points of failure. Software diversity gives users more choices and limits the number of users exposed to compromises. When users don't have options, compromising one package can affect all users. A better situation than a monoculture is for users to have more options and petition the blast radius of any potential attack vector. But even better is more software diversity and fewer dependencies each. The ideal ecosystem gives us more options, but each of these has fewer dependencies, limiting the blast radius of compromises and decreasing the attack surface for every option. Building more platforms, making tools that meet diverse needs, can also be a layer in our security strategy. So what can we do to improve the situation?
So reinforcing this $1 trillion digital infrastructure isn't someone else's job. It's a shared responsibility. So we decided we're going to break this down into somewhat concrete actions for everyone. For companies, fund your dependencies. They're not charities, it's critical risk management. Become a member of organizations like the OpenSSF, or find your top 20 most critical dependencies and fund them. It costs you less than a single engineer's salary and will do a lot more to secure your supply chain than almost anything else. And then donate developer time. Your engineers are already using the software. Give them a formal budget of time, 1 day a month, 20% time, whatever it is, to contribute back to the upstream projects you rely on. When your developers have a relationship with maintainers, you build trust and gain influence.
For the community, we recommend having a code of conduct and ensuring that it is actively enforced promise, not just a document. Culture is something we do every single day. Put that code of conduct to work by actively moderating your community spaces and ensuring that the community actually represents what you intend to build. If someone's making unreasonable demands or making anyone uncomfortable, be clear where the line is and when they've stepped over it. And share your experiences. Let the wider community know what your project is dealing with so that they know and you know that you are not alone. You never know how many others have a shared experience until you speak out.
And for security professionals, don't just give maintainers issues or problems, give them solutions. Go a step further and send that pull request instead of just throwing problems over a wall and assuming someone else will patch that vulnerability. If it's an open source, make an attempt at it. Even if you don't know how to fix it, give as much information as you can to help them fix it. Not every project has the support of someone with security knowledge. So contribute your security knowledge. Seth Larson of Python recently gave a keynote where he called for a new model of contributor, where we need to decouple the security work that maintainers put under from the maintainer role. Because maintainers they are domain experts. They're not actually security experts a lot of the time. And so forcing them to handle every security issue alone leads to burnout and fear. So Seth proposed a new model of security contributor, which is trusted individuals who aren't maintainers but can triage vulnerabilities, configure security settings, and harden the release process on behalf of projects.
And for every developer, be engaged with your upstream, be involved and give back, be a part of the community. If you care enough to file an issue, you care enough to understand the issue. If the maintainers of your dependencies have left or are feeling overwhelmed, you'll find out more quickly and can take action if you're involved or send a change. When you find a bug, don't just say it's broken. Provide a minimal, reproducible example. You're asking for someone's free time. Respect it by doing the prep work. And the best bug report is a pull request. Try to fix the issues yourself. Include tests. You'll not only get your bug fixed faster, but you'll have an actively reduced a maintainer's workload. You switched from being a consumer to a collaborator. And most importantly, be kind. The next time a library saves you hours of work, find its repository and open an issue that just says thank you. You might be the only positive message that maintainer receives all week. It matters. Now, just to wrap things up, let's reflect again on the question of XZ. The solution to a lot of these problems, to malicious contributors, isn't just to stop trusting each other. It's to build healthier communities and better systems that scale and verify trust. Before targeting XZ, Geotan targeted the libarchive project, but due to a strong maintainership, his pull requests were rejected, and he refocused on a more vulnerable target, XZ. Open source is at the heart of our industry, and we all need to work to keep it alive and healthy.
So yeah, let's build a community based on collaboration, not demands, on shared responsibility, not isolated burnout, and on scalable, verifiable trust. Because in open source, security isn't just a special sauce you can add at the end. Thank you. That was. I would put a question slide up, but we don't have one. Yes?
Right. So you've shown a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm.
How do we deal with AI slap?
That's a good question.
Like, force everyone to make PRs?
I think that also ties back to the question of having empathy for the developer. I think, oh, of course. So the question was, how do we deal with AI slop? And I think we need to tie that back to having empathy and making sure that those tools are developed in a way that considers the impact it will have on developers and making sure that everyone's part of the community. I think if we consider this as part of a social contract, those sort of actors who are just spamming people aren't part of the social contract. They don't deserve to be given back to.
Yeah, I also think that the psychology behind who's actually making these AI slop is kind of interesting as well. I think it's, in some cases, used as a cheat code in trying to, I don't know, hopefully they will run AI and it will find some issue and then they just want to get recognition for it, or sometimes monetary value when it comes to bugs, obviously, with bug bounties. But
it's exploitation.
Yeah, it's exploitation, and I think it's starts very on in the development life cycle to establish a really good community.
It could also be a way of covering.
No? Great. Well, thank you very much for attending.